Huh?
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Today, Radio 1 Charlotte is helping one another across the state of North Carolina. The WBT alongside Radio 1 in Charlotte, as well as the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metrolina, is asking you to help one another in a time of need here across the state. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP, the number 1, to 44834, and make your donation today. You can also visit our website and find out more details at WBT.com. A busy day this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We have the latest details from our October Carolina Journal poll. That'll be coming up here in less than 2 minutes this morning. It continues to be a busy day because early voting in North Carolina for the 2024 general election kicks off this morning across the Tar Heel State. A total of 419 early voting sites will be open statewide, and officials expect a high turnout this year in early voting despite storm damage in western counties. In those 25 counties that are still dealing with the effects of Hurricane Helene, 76 of 80 planned early voting sites will be operational. That's just slightly below the original plan. Karen Brinson Bell, who is the head of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, praised the resilience of residents in storm-impacted areas for ensuring that early voting remains accessible. Absentee voting does remain available throughout the state as well, and the North Carolina General Assembly has allocated an additional $5 million in disaster relief. That's to support election operations out west. Early voting will end coming up on November the 2nd, with election results coming out hopefully later the night on Election Day, November the 5th. We'll have breaking poll details throughout the show this morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Another busy day in North Carolina is the State Fair also opens today at noon. It runs for the next 10 days through October the 27th. It features food, rides, musical events, exhibits, contests, and more. This year is the 156th annual State Fair, growing from what it was a 4-day affair. Back in 1853, it only drew 4,000 people on its first day. Now it's a 10-plus day experience that averages over 900,000 attendees each year. That takes place up at the North Carolina State Fairgrounds in Raleigh. The North Carolina Agricultural Commissioner and Steve Troxler told the media earlier this week that the ag business is over $111 billion in North Carolina, and said that the State Fair is, quote, the largest, brightest, flashiest platform to showcase that industry anywhere across the state. So the North Carolina State Fair opening this morning as well. It's now 5:08 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Early voting is here. Election Day is less than 3 weeks away. What is the status of political races in North Carolina? Exclusively this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, we've got the latest and the last Carolina Journal poll ahead of the November election. Donna King from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning. Donna, good morning to you. Some folks call it the start of early voting. Election Day. It's here. We've got a lot of interesting stuff to get into with some of these races.
We absolutely do. That's the first thing I'm going to do this morning is head out and vote. Early voting, we're really seeing is on the upswing. I think you've seen a really concerted effort by Republicans to try and get their folks out early. Democrats were already on board with that. We've seen a trend over the last decade or so, really just since that Democrats tend to get out early and vote. They tend to take advantage of those early voting days and absentee ballots more than Republicans, but somehow that's a philosophy. I think Republicans in general really like casting that ballot on election day. That trend, though, we're seeing in this poll, 58% of folks in the poll that we had that's fresh out this morning said that they plan to vote early. And that compares to about 53% in our last poll.
Let's dive into some of the details on that polling. Donna, the top of the ticket, North Carolina continues to be a major battleground state. J.D. Vance was here yesterday in Wilmington. Kamala Harris and her surrogates are going to be in the state over the next couple of weeks. Where do we stand in the presidential race here in North Carolina?
I mean, razor thin, narrow margin here in North Carolina. Like in most swing states, what we're seeing is they're essentially tied here in North Carolina. Former President Donald Trump, Vice President Kamala Harris, in a basic tie at 47%. One of the things that we've seen really is that independent voters, we watch them more and more as time goes on because now unaffiliated voters are our largest voting bloc in North Carolina, but not a monolith, of course. Independent voters are really closely split right now at 44% Trump, 45% Harris, but 4% of those independent voters say that they would vote for a third-party candidate. Now, Trump has picked up about 5% of the independent vote as they get closer and closer to the election compared to Harris. Harris has only gained about 2% of those independent voters since our last poll. So we're watching those really closely. This is really going to come down to just a handful of votes, like it will in just a handful of counties and generally. And that's how a lot of these races are going to be across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw the margins in 2020, less than 1.5 points for Donald Trump in his victory against Joe Biden in the state, of course, in 2020. Now, Donna, this is the first Carolina Journal poll since we learned about a month ago or so about Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, the CNN story, his response to that with a $50 million lawsuit. It seems to be affecting his polling, at least in the Carolina Journal poll.
Absolutely. Now, our current Attorney General, Josh Stein, is leading by 49% in a larger margin than we had in the last poll to Mark Robinson's 36%. It really is showing that race is really going to be separated by much more than we originally expected since all of that controversy and scandal. Now, since then, also, Robinson has announced that he is suing CNN, wants $50 million for a defamation of character lawsuit against CNN. Now, the question, though, is what impact will this have on down ballot candidates? What will it mean for the state legislature? What will it mean for the rest of the Council of State, which in North Carolina are individually elected?
We'll talk about the Council of State here in a second. I want to turn to this 11% still undecided in this race. That is a huge margin compared to the presidential race, Donna, where it's under 5%.
Sure. I mean, some of that really may come down to name recognition, despite what, those of us who follow politics pretty closely, a lot of folks may not even know who these people are, and they're hearing from them mostly from ads. You're seeing them pop up on YouTube, you're seeing them pop up during football games, you're seeing them all the time, these ads. And ads, political ads, fewer than 1% of North Carolinians think that they're a good way to find out about the candidates. So while they're being bombarded with these ads, and I'm ready to see them all go away, I'm about ready for November 6th right now, but people don't really know that they're a good way to know about the candidates. So I think that's why you're seeing such a big gap in undecided. Even if they're starting to hear who Stein and Robinson are, they don't really know what to think of them.
Let's turn to some of those down ballot effects. We've got a question in the poll about generic state legislature races, and this is a change from what Carolina Journal has had in the past. Not the question, but the results, correct?
Sure. Now, a generic ballot, in other words, it really basically means if you weren't going to vote for a candidate by name, if the election were held right now and you had to vote for a Democrat or a Republican, would you vote for the Democrat or the Republican? In the state legislature, that has now narrowed. It shows a Republican, it shows a Democrat slight advantage at about 46% Democrat to 47% Republican, certainly within the margin of error for this. But before this, it was tied at about 46%. Now, that is big news for North Carolina because for the better part, for a decade and more, really, more like 12 years, Republicans have run the state legislature. They've had control, at times a supermajority in the state legislature. And out of that, those more conservative policies have really, lower taxes, fewer regulations. Those things have really become a hallmark of North Carolina and how we've become known nationally for fiscal management and those things. So what does this mean for that Republican majority or even supermajority, though it be narrow right now, when we go into that next legislative session come January?
We'll look at a couple of other races, including Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor with Donna King coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. A big day today across our Radio 1 stations in Charlotte, WBT, Radio 1 Charlotte, and the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metro Line are asking you to help our friends out in Western North Carolina. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP the number 1 to 44834 and make your donation today. You can find out more details on our website, WBT.com. It's 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Let's get a look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:19. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. WBT alongside Radio 1 Charlotte and the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metrolina are asking you to help one another in this time of need across the state of North Carolina. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP, the number 1, to 44834 and make your donation today. You can also visit our website, WBT.com. Thank you for helping one another across this time of need in the state of North Carolina. Well, breaking this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, our latest statewide political poll shows a razor-thin race between Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. 47.2% of voters support Trump, while 46.6% of voters support Harris. A razor-thin race there. Turning our attention to a race that is not showing very close in our Carolina Journal poll, Mark Robinson, the current lieutenant governor, continues to run behind Attorney General Josh Stein. Polling shows in our recent Carolina Journal poll, 49.3% support Stein, with just 35.8% supporting Robinson. We continue to track details on this poll. Donna King from the Carolina Journal will have additional details with us coming up in less than 2 minutes. Voting sites across the state will open their doors to voters today as early voting kicks off across the state, offering 17 days of early voting ahead of Election Day for folks to cast their ballots in the 2024 general election. From Tennessee to the Atlantic Ocean, 419 early voting sites will be open starting around 8 o'clock or so this morning, and voters can go to any site open in their county to cast a ballot. And though hours of operations will vary by location, early voting will offer flexibility to voters with weekend and evening hours. In Mecklenburg County, they are the largest in terms of early voting locations. 33 sites will be open this morning. That follows by Guilford County with 28 locations open, and Wake County will have 22 sites available for early voting. Despite the destruction caused by Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina, 76 early voting sites will be open to voters a little bit later on today in those 25 counties where there is a federal disaster declaration listed. Only 4 of the originally planned sites are not opening as intended. Avery County added an additional site following a report from the State Board of Elections last week. During presidential elections, roughly 25,000 people work at voting sites across the state. Impacted counties are also reporting that they are well staffed at early voting sites and Election Day sites, so getting out the vote in western North Carolina does continue to be a major topic. We continue to track it here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. 523 News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Continuing our conversation this morning with Donna King from the Carolina Journal as we look at hot off the presses, the latest Carolina Journal poll as folks head to early voting locations across the state this morning. Donna, we looked at some of the more impactful races, president, governor, but there are a lot of council of state and other races that you guys polled here over at Carolina Journal. What are we seeing with the latest on those?
Well, one thing it's important to note that a lot of folks may not know is that North Carolina's Council of State is all individually elected, as opposed to, say, a cabinet for the governor, which might run different agencies. Council of State includes things like Secretary of State, Attorney General, Insurance Commissioner, all of those kind of things. Among them is the Lieutenant Governor, elected separately from the governor. And in this past session, we've had Governor Roy Cooper, a Democrat, and Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. Now, in this case, we've got Hal Weatherman, a Republican, running against Democrat Rachel Hunt. Right now, we see Democrat Rachel Hunt in our poll leading 43% to Hal Weatherman's 41%. That race, of course, tightening because Hal Weatherman had a lead considerably there for a little while. And it really begs the question if the Robinson scandal is dragging down some of those other Council of State races for Republicans, because Democrats are edging them out in many of the cases. We're watching Treasurer really closely. It's an important one for the state of North Carolina when we talk about fiscal responsibility and Republican Brad Briner. So there's also DPI. We're watching that really closely because Michelle Morrow, right now we have Mo Green, who is a Charlotte-based. He was part of sort of the infrastructure, that sort of historic part of North Carolina's education system. Michelle Morrow is much more of a school choice Republican based type of candidate. She is interested in really changing a lot of what we see in public schools, but also talks a lot about building those relationships back with teachers. So whether it's going to be a wholesale change if Michelle Morrow comes in, or Mo Green, which will probably be more in line with the NCAE and some of those traditional Democrat values. Mo Green is leading Michelle Morrow in our latest poll. Certainly, there is a lot of support on both of them from their bases. This race has been very, very closely watched.
When we talk about some of these other Council of State races, it has been over 100 years since a Republican has sat in the office of Attorney General in North Carolina, a very high stakes race for that. What's Carolina Journal poll have for the details on that?
Sure, no question about it. We have two North Carolina congressmen running for the AG spot. We have Republican Dan Bishop, who is hoping to be that first Republican in a century in the spot, running against Jeff Jackson, a Democrat. Right now, what we're seeing is Jeff Jackson edging Bishop out just a bit. And we're also seeing that with Bishop, he is really talking about sort of a law and order platform for his campaign. And part of that is we've seen under Cooper and Stein, our current attorney general, there's been conflict with the Republican-led legislature over what laws will be enforced, what cases will be brought up. So it is going to be interesting to see how that relationship balances out if we end up with a Dan Bishop, say, in the attorney general's office and a Josh Stein in the governor's office. So we'll be watching that race very closely. But right now we've got Republican Dan Bishop at 43%, and then Democrat Jeff Jackson at 46%. Also, that is within the margin of error as well. These races are all incredibly tight.
And I'm glad you brought that up. And we talked to Donald Bryson last month about the poll. He brought up this point, Donna, that the poll is just a snapshot of what's going on right now. These are not necessarily the election results. They could be, but these are not necessarily the election results. And similar to some of our other races, you have 10% of people that are still undecided with that small margin. One of these candidates could end up having a breakaway.
Absolutely, no question about it. And we also have, so many people undecided, and it also comes down to who shows up. So the very top of the ticket, that Harris-Trump race really will determine what we see happening down ballot, because there's a big movement to make sure people fill out their entire ballot, but that doesn't always happen. A lot of times people will show up and vote for the top of the ticket, the first two. If they don't recognize the rest of the names, they just turn it in. So filling out the rest of the ballot is an important part, and both parties are really pushing their base to get in there, show up, and fill out the entire ballot.
Yeah, if anybody's had an opportunity to look at their sample ballot, in some cases it's almost 2 full pages, depending on where you're voting. There are so many contests, everything from local soil and water commissioners up to the president of the United States. There's a lot on there. Donna, a continued question in the Carolina Journal poll is, what is your top issue as a voter? We really haven't seen much movement in that for quite some time.
We really haven't. I mean, runaway, every single poll, we're seeing that inflation and prices, even just like it was now, even more so than our September poll. Now, 32% of people say that inflation and prices are their runaway top most important issue. That's up from September, where just 29% said that was their top issue. Now, in this poll, you can see across your screen there that we had a lot of options for respondents to say what was their most important one. I will point out, though, that abortion moved up. So it used to be in September and well before, inflation and prices was number one, jobs in the economy was consistently number two, immigration was consistently number three, with abortion coming in at 4 or below. Or now we're seeing the abortion issue move higher. And I think the result of that is really those advertisements endorsements. That's what we've been seeing happen throughout this campaign. And whether people believe it or not, they may not think that, this is a good way to learn about candidates, but certainly the Democrats' message is getting through.
The latest Carolina Journal poll also asked some questions about responses from both federal and state officials in regards to the devastation in western North Carolina left by Hurricane Helene. We'll have those details with Donna King coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Our Helping One Another Radiothon continues today on WBT. You can text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP, the number 1 to 44834, and make your donation today to help your fellow North Carolinians in their time of need. More details on our website, WBT.com. 529 News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at the roads this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Nick.
It's 5:35. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. WBT, Radio 1 Charlotte, and the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metro-Lina are asking you to help one another in this time of devastation and need across western North Carolina. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP, the number 1 to 44834, and make your donation today. More details available as well on our website, WBT.com. Thank you for helping one another. Breaking this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, the latest and last Carolina Journal poll ahead of the 2024 general election continues to show a razor-thin race between former President Trump and Vice President Harris. 47.2% of voters supporting Trump in our poll compared to 46.6% supporting Harris. Very much within the margin of error there. Mark Robinson, the current lieutenant governor, continues to run behind Attorney General Josh Stein. Our state poll shows that 49.3% of voters support Stein, with 35.8% of voters supporting Robinson. We'll wrap up that poll in a conversation with Donna King coming up for you in less than 2 minutes. Well, the North Carolina State Fair opens today at noon. It runs for 11 days through October the 27th. It features food, rides, musical events, exhibits, contests, and more. This year, the 156th annual State Fair has grown from what it was, a 4-day event back in 1853 that drew just 4,000 people at the time, to what now the multi-day experience that averages over 900,000 attendees every year. The North Carolina Agricultural Commissioner and Steve Troxler told media earlier this week that the ag business is a nearly $111 billion industry in North Carolina, and said that the state fair is the largest, brightest, and flashiest platform to showcase that industry. Troxler said more and more people are 2 or 3 generations removed from the farm, and grocery stores and farmers markets are the main place to buy food, which means understanding the connection between the farm and the table is less apparent. He said, "I want people to know where their food comes from, and that agriculture and the agribusiness makes up the state's leading industry." Troxler said that the fair helping people connect with North Carolina's agriculture, including introducing it to newcomers and those unfamiliar with the state's number one industry. In addition to the rides and, of course, all of the exotic food that's available, this year's fair will feature livestock shows and highlights the fruits, vegetables, plants, and flowers grown in the states. There will be dairy exhibits, soil and water forestry displays, antique farming equipment, working tobacco barns, and heritage crafters who use agricultural products will all be on display. You can find out more details on the State Fair website. That's at the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, ncagr.gov. That's ncagr.gov for details on the 2024 North Carolina State Fair. It's now 5:39 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing this morning with the latest Carolina Journal poll, Donna King from the Carolina Journal joins us. Donna, with us, all the devastation and destruction left out west, this Carolina Journal poll was in the field at a time where there's been a lot of questions about federal and state response. You asked a couple of those questions, and I thought the responses were rather interesting.
I thought they were too, actually. We were trying to get at, one, what is the public perception, the public confidence in the state and federal government's ability to respond to a disaster? Certainly what we found, and it really is not a big surprise, that those who were most impacted by Hurricane Helene were the least confident in emergency authorities' ability to respond. But one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting, one, that a plurality of voters, about 38%, if you sort of add them up, in North Carolina said that they have a great deal of confidence in emergency authorities, but 30% said they had no confidence in emergency authorities. If you look specifically at the Charlotte area, 33% said that they have little or no confidence at all in North Carolina's emergency response authorities. And FEMA, 42% was favorable, compared to 53% of people in Charlotte were unfavorable on FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I thought this was really particularly interesting because Charlotte being, geographically closer to the western part of the state, Western North Carolina, which was, devastated by Hurricane Helene, they're seeing some of those people coming in, refugees, if you're going to, for lack of a better word, of their state neighbors coming in and seeing the real impact and that has happened. But I do think it's interesting, one, that 62%, about 2/3 of voters said that disaster relief should be equally federal and state and local responsibility. So, when we look at disaster response, we see this sort of what looks like a hodgepodge of, local officials, volunteer firemen, sheriffs, people who have a helicopter, churches, all of these groups coming together to respond. And then you also see groups like the North Carolina National Guard from other states, and FEMA coming in. 62% said it should be an equal federal and state and local response. When we look at that, 23% said it should be just a federal responsibility. So I think it's important to note that people recognize how powerful their local communities are and their local first responders are, and that they think they should be, more empowered, helped out, boosted up in an emergency response. Now, if you look at Charlotte, though, specifically, Charlotte's folks are more likely to say it should be a primarily federal responsibility than other parts of the state. So it is interesting to see there's just kind of a different perspective in Charlotte compared to the rest of the state. And that's something I think that we're going to see a lot of emergency response officials looking at moving forward. How can we boost up those who were there, boots on the ground in the first hours after Helene?
Do you think some of this comes from the fact we saw Joe Biden was here a couple days after Helene hit the area, and he came in, got a briefing at the Department of Emergency Management headquarters in Raleigh and said, hey, we're going to pick up the tab for 6 months. We're going to deploy all these resources. Do you think it's some of that messaging that maybe folks believe that, yeah, absolutely, if the federal government's going to pick up the tab, it should be, quote, for lack of a better term, Donna, their problem to deal with?
I do think that. I think that people, are looking for somebody, the cavalry, to come in, but there have been a lot of people who've just been disappointed, and that's part of the challenge: is how do you spread control and authority out? But those groups would also need the money. So I think a lot of people want to say, okay, we're going to have the federal government come in, but now they're being sorely disappointed because it's not going to be somebody from FEMA picking people up off a rooftop. FEMA is more of a long-term trailers, and here's a form to fill out and get your roof put back on, and all those kind of things. They're a long-term agency. Those who are going to be those first responders, who are going to be saving lives and providing water and getting coats and hats and gloves, that's going to be your local community in the vast majority of cases. So how do we build them up? How do we empower them and make them more effective?
There was a question in the poll about what generally people thought about FEMA. What are the details on that?
I mean, generally people are net unfavorable on FEMA for the most part. And some of that is because we are right here still in the recovery from a disastrous situation in Western North Carolina. So FEMA's got about a 53% unfavorable rating in our poll, particularly in the Charlotte area. Overall, 36% of North Carolinians say little to no confidence in FEMA right now. So I do think that it's just getting a bad show right now on what we're seeing happening out in Western North Carolina for the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Donna, big day for Carolina Journal, our final poll of the election cycle. Big day for the state with the first day of early voting. Any final takeaways from this polling, and where can folks go to find out more details about it and really maybe dig into some of the data?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is to get out there. I mean, I'm encouraging, all three of my kids are now old enough to vote. I'm making sure everybody has got it on their calendar, getting out there, making sure you bring your ID. Some of those ID requirements are being waived in the western part of the state for folks who've just lost everything, but 90% of the polling locations are going to be operating in Western North Carolina. The State Board of Elections is focused pretty heavily on getting those sites open, getting people aid, making sure they have what they need to cast a ballot. So it really is important just to get out there, take advantage of early voting, make sure your vote counts heading into November 5th.
You can find out and read more details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Be part of helping our One Another Radiothon here on WBT. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP, H-E-L-P, the number 1 to 44834, and make your donation today. Thank you for helping one another. 545 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Hot.
The Radio 1 Charlotte Helping One Another Radiothon continues this morning on WBT alongside the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metrolina. We are asking you to help one another in this time of need across the state. Text HELP1 to 44834. That's HELP1, the number 1, to 44834 and make your donation today. You can also visit our website, WBT.com, and click on the Help One Another link to donate. Again, text HELP1 to 44834 now. Thank you for helping one another. It's 5:51 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. We are continuing to track the latest and last Carolina Journal poll out ahead of the November general election on this first day of early voting, and it continues to show a razor-thin race between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. 47.2% of voters support Trump in that race, compared to 46.6% for Harris. Mark Robinson in the very high-stakes North Carolina gubernatorial race does continue to run behind Josh Stein. Our polling shows that 49.3% of voters support Stein. That's compared to 35.8% that support Robinson, as he continues to struggle in polls some 3 weeks after a major CNN expose. And we learned earlier this week that he is now suing CNN at the tune of $50 million in response to their reporting on that story. We'll continue to track those details over on our website, carolinajournal.com. Well, as we've been talking about all morning, a busy day in North Carolina. The state fair opens, early voting starts today, and turning our attention to early voting this morning, it begins across all 100 counties in North Carolina. There are a total of 419 early voting sites that will be open statewide, and what we've seen in the last couple of elections indicate how popular early voting is across the state. There's a high likelihood that hundreds of thousands of voters from across the state make their way to an early voting site today to cast their ballots for the general election. Though hours of operations will vary by location, early voting does offer a lot of flexibility for voters with both weekend and evening hours. The State Board of Elections Executive Director and Karen Brinson Bell said at a press conference earlier this week, "What we know is that early voting is the most popular voting method in North Carolina. So we believe that we will see that again as many people turn out to vote in 2024 across the state, including those in affected counties. Those affected counties, of course, are the 25 western North Carolina counties that are listed in the Federal Disaster Declaration. However, the good news to pass along is that over 90% of the planned early voting sites out west will be open. 76 of 80 early voting sites will be open, at least in some part, starting today. In 2016, 62% of North Carolinians voted early. 65% voted early in the 2020 presidential general election. And officials with the State Board of Elections say they could see a higher percentage of turnout this year in early voting, despite some of that storm damage. Both pushes from the Republican and Democrat Party are pushing early voting big time. We're not exactly sure, but hopefully we'll have day one early voting totals coming up for you tomorrow morning. That information typically gets posted to the State Board of Election sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. So if we have those numbers, we will, of course, bring them to you coming up on a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. Keeping our thread on a busy day across the State Fair opens today. The 156th Annual State Fair up at the Raleigh State Fairgrounds, right off the campus of NC State, kicks off this morning and runs through October the 27th. Listen to this. When the State Fair started in 1853, it was a 4-day event and drew just 4,000 people on its inaugural event. Now it's a 10-day experience that averages more than 900,000 attendees. 900,000. It will feature food, rides, musical events, exhibits, contests, and more. Steve Troxler, who is the North Carolina Agriculture Commissioner, said that the agricultural business in North Carolina is a $111 billion industry. And the State Fair really is a great example of showcasing what the agricultural industry provides. Troxler said that the fair helps people connect with the North Carolina agriculture, including to newcomers and those unfamiliar with the state's number one industry, which is ag. In addition to rides and food, the fair this year will feature livestock. It will highlight fruits, vegetables, plants, and flowers grown in the state of North Carolina. And according to Troxler, he says, I want people to know where their food comes from and that agriculture makes up the state's leading industry. Tickets and more details are available for the 2024 State Fair. All of that is on the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services website. That's ncagr.gov. ncagr.gov for more details on the 2024 North Carolina State Fair. Our Radio 1 Radiothon Helping One Another continues today. You can text HELP to 44834. That's HELP, H-E-L-P, the number 1 to 44834 to make your donation today. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning at 5 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.